The conference room in Addis Ababa wasn't just crowded, it was electric. Security guards stood taller than usual. Translators murmured nervously into their headsets. This wasn't a routine summit. It was an emergency gathering called the Stability and Cooperation Forum, pulled together in response to a fresh surge of terrorist violence tearing through Mali and northern Burkina Faso. Inside, the room was a who's who of global diplomacy. Envoys from the African Union, stern-faced EU delegates, silent Chinese observers, and the unmistakable presence of the United States, represented by Vice President Kamala Harris. She rose first to speak. Wearing a navy blue suit and the tone of practiced confidence, her voice rang clear through the room as she delivered a familiar message, one that had echoed in summit after summit. Democracy, human rights, diversity, and market openness, she said, were the foundations of peace. Africa must reject extremism, she added, but also embrace universal values that protect minorities' identity, expression, inclusion. But when she said that last line, she didn't scan the room. She looked directly intentionally at one man, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He sat silently in the third row. No entourage, no notches, just a traditional cotton tunic and eyes that didn't blink. When it was his turn, he stood slowly. No applause, no nods, just silence. And then he spoke. The African people are not dying from a lack of lectures on democracy. He began, his voice low but steady. They are dying from a lack of security, from a lack of economic autonomy, from a lack of respect. The room shifted. No one moved. But the atmosphere tightened like a held breath. Kamala Harris didn't flinch, but her posture stiffened. Some Western diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked down at their papers. No one interrupted. What kills us, Traoré continued, is not the absence of gender training in our army. It is the presence of foreign weapons in the hands of terrorists. You say you're fighting. A gasp quiet. But Real escaped from the back rows. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. But every word sliced like a scalpel. Africa is not a laboratory for imported ideas, he said, locking eyes with no one, yet addressing everyone. Africa is a sovereign continent. That was it. That was the moment. A phrase that hung in the air like a thunderclap. Africa is not a laboratory. Kamala Harris leaned back in her chair. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The chill said enough. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. Traoré didn't smile, didn't grandstand. He simply folded his hands and waited for the next speaker. But the room was no longer the same. Something unspoken had shifted. And even before the tweets, the headlines, or the press releases, everyone inside knew this was no longer just a summit. This was a line in the sand. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't raised his voice, but his words were still ringing in the room like a fire alarm. No one knew how to silence. And then he continued, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling: calm clarity. For decades, he said, we've been taught to imitate, to copy and paste systems designed far from our soil. We were told that freedom comes through reforms drafted by consultants who've never stepped foot in an African village. You could feel the discomfort. Eyes darted, throats cleared. The usual diplomatic mask of neutral politeness was beginning to crack. And now, he said, While our people face war, hunger, and exile, we're told again, be democratic. As if democracy alone can stop the bullets from an AK-47 held by a child soldier who hasn't eaten in 3 days. He let that silence breathe. Somewhere near the front, the representative from Guinea nodded just slightly. The president of Mali folded his arms, looking up with the kind of quiet pride you show when someone else says what you've felt all along. Traoré looked across the sea of suits and ties, and then back to his fellow African leaders. I'm not here to offend anyone, he said. I'm here to remind us that Burkina Faso is a free nation, and we will not bend our course for promises made with smiles but delivered with conditions. A low murmur started building. We are fighting armed enemies who cross our borders. We've seen drones spying from the sky, tracking our movements like we're prey. Is that partnership? Is that solidarity? This wasn't a speech anymore. It was a mirror, and some didn't like what they saw in it. Kamala Harris raised an eyebrow. An aide leaned in to whisper something. She waved them off. Let him finish, she mouthed. And so he did. If our allies truly wish to help us, Traoré said, his voice unwavering, they must begin by respecting our decisions. If they cannot do that, they are not allies. They are just new faces of old domination. No shouting, no dramatic pauses, but the silence afterward deafening. He slowly returned to his seat. The rustle of his cotton garment, the only sound in the room. He hadn't used a script, hadn't needed one. The weight of his words came not from performance, but from conviction. The moderator took a breath, as if emerging from deep water, but no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were still on Traoré. What just happened? A young military leader from a country most couldn't point to on a map had just flipped the table. Not with outrage, but with honesty. Not with protest, but with purpose. And across Africa from Dakar to Dar es Salaam screens were lighting up because in that moment, something extraordinary had happened. A leader didn't ask to be heard. He demanded it without ever raising his voice. The silence in the room didn't break, it thickened. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't just shaken foreign diplomats. Now, he turned inward toward the men and women seated around him. Fellow African leaders, presidents, ministers, veterans of summits where words often outlived actions. But this time, it was different. He scanned the room, not with judgment, but with a challenge in his eyes. For how long? He asked quietly. Will we define ourselves by the reflections others give us? No one answered. They didn't have to. He stepped slightly forward, no longer speaking only to the West, but to the heart of Africa itself. We were told progress comes in the form of reforms, he said, guided by spreadsheets, timelines, and imported ideals. But these ideals arrive with consultants who have never seen our droughts, never walked through our burned villages, never buried a child under a collapsed roof. The weight of those words didn't just land, they lingered. A few heads turned down, others clenched their hands. Not in defiance, but in something more honest recognition. We are told, Traoré continue, that we must become democratic to earn protection. But what democracy guards us when a jihadist crosses the border with a machine gun? What election protects a farmer when his land becomes a battlefield? The room was no longer just listening. It was absorbing. And then he cut even deeper. We are not refusing peace. We are refusing lectures. We are not rejecting freedom. We are rejecting the illusion that it can only be delivered through someone else's lens. It was no longer political. It was personal. And in that moment, he wasn't just a president. He was a mirror, forcing Africa to see its own scars, its own compromises, its own truth. The world wants to help us, he asked. Then let it begin with listening. He paused, locking eyes with a few of the youngest leaders in the room, because while we sit here, debating principles, he said, our people are building defenses with scrap metal, guiding their villages with no maps, holding on to dignity with no resources. A deep breath swept across the conference. Traoré'S voice lowered one final time. This is not a rebellion, he said. It is a return to ourselves, to our soil, to our sovereignty. No applause, no grandstanding, just stillness. And in that stillness, something began to take root. He had spoken without fury, but ignited a fire. He had questioned without condemning, but called everyone to account. And when he sat down, it wasn't just the Western diplomats who felt exposed. It was the entire post-colonial script that had just been quietly but unmistakably torn apart. Because Traoré had flipped the question. It was no longer, what will the West do for Africa? It was, what will Africa do for itself? Before the summit even ended, the world had already begun reacting. Clips of Ibrahim Traoré's speech flooded social media. Twitter timelines lit up. TikTok was ablaze with hashtags. African youth shared one phrase over and over again, like a badge of pride. Africa is not a laboratory. But not everyone was celebrating. In Washington, the press room at the State Department filled quickly. A spokesperson tried to downplay the moment, calling the exchange a difference in tone. But it was clear something had cracked. Reporters pushed harder, asking if U.S. military support to Sahel countries was now at risk. Hours later, an answer came. The U.S. Congress quietly passed an updated resolution. New conditions for all future aid to the Sahel: strict commitment to democracy, adherence to human rights, and clear alignment with shared values. The message was obvious. You challenge us publicly, you pay privately. Across the Atlantic, the European Union echoed the discomfort. A statement from Brussels called Traoré's remarks reckless and counterproductive to regional cooperation. But unlike the U.S., they didn't suspend funding. Not yet. Their words said caution, but their actions said fear. And while diplomats scrambled, another front opened. International NGOs, many of which operated within Burkina Faso, began releasing reports accusing the country's defense forces of alleged abuses during operations against armed insurgents. Traoré's government denied the claims, but the timing was suspicious. Some saw coincidence, others saw coordination. Still, Traoré didn't flinch. He called a press conference in Ouagadougou. Behind him stood the flags of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, symbols of a growing regional alliance. His voice was calm but firm, his message unmistakable. Burkina Faso does not accept blackmail, he said. Those who help us must do so because they believe in our struggle. Those who set conditions do not offer help, they offer control. By his side stood army officers, traditional leaders, and volunteers, men and women who had seen the front lines with their own eyes. He wasn't speaking alone. He was speaking with his people. And that scared people more than any fiery speech. Meanwhile, in boardrooms across Europe and briefing rooms in Washington, the anxiety spread. Analysts debated whether Traoré was isolating his country or leading it into a new, self-reliant era. Think tanks updated their Sahel strategy memos. Intelligence reports flagged regional destabilization. But the question was no longer about control. It was about momentum. Because for all the diplomatic scolding, something unexpected was happening on the ground. African leaders, not just in the Sahel, were listening. They weren't all nodding, but they were paying attention closely. What began as a speech was becoming something else, entirely a shift in posture, in pride, in the language of independence, and in the corridors of power, far from dusty villages and border towns. Western officials were learning a hard truth. Traoré hadn't declared war. He'd declared direction. And the world wasn't sure how to stop a movement that didn't start with weapons, but with words that refused to be erased. While the world argued over soundbites and sanctions, Ibrahim Traoré did something no one expected. He disappeared from the spotlight. No press statements. No Twitter threads. No emergency interviews with international media. Instead, he boarded an unmarked vehicle and headed straight into the heart of Burkina Faso, into Kaya, a region scorched by war, fear, and silence. There were no motorcades, no red carpets, just dust, wind, and the faces of those forgotten. He arrived unannounced, dressed not as a president, but as a man of the soil, simple cotton tunic, boots worn thin, sleeves rolled up. Word spread fast. People emerged from makeshift shelters, women balancing plastic buckets, men with shovels, children with eyes too tired for their age. And then he sat. No stage, no podium. Just a wooden bench under a half-collapsed mango tree, surrounded by villagers with questions they'd never had the chance to ask. One woman stepped forward. Her scarf was tied tightly over her forehead, her voice shaky, but sharp. "We don't want more conferences," she said. "We don't want more advisors. We want to plant, reap, and sleep without running. We want our children to live." Traoré didn't respond. Not right away. He just nodded. That moment, one voice among the noise was louder than any summit. And then, with the village watching, he stood and spoke, not to cameras, not to donors, but to the people who had everything to lose. "I didn't go to Addis Ababa to be polite," he said. "I went to say what no one else was willing to say, that we do not need to be taught how to survive in our own land." He pointed toward the horizon, where smoke still drifted from a nearby burned field. "No one out there," he said, "knows what it's like to fall asleep to gunfire and wake up not knowing if your child will make it to school." The crowd stood frozen, not in fear, but in awakening. And that's when the shift happened. Traoré didn't wait for permission. He called village leaders to form an emergency network. He distributed communication radios. He promised a regional command center, built not with foreign monitors, but local hands. That same day, trucks rolled into Kaya from the National Strategic Reserve, loaded with food, medicine, and blankets. No NGOs. No outside logos. Just the state, standing tall for its people. Volunteers began signing up. Fathers returned to burned homes with hope. Mothers cried not from fear, but because someone finally came and listened. By nightfall, videos began to surface. A shaky cell phone clip showed Traoré holding the hands of an elderly man, his head bowed in silence. Another showed him smiling with a group of young boys, handing them notebooks instead of speeches. The message was simple. Real leadership doesn't just confront power in conference rooms. It kneels in the dirt. It listens where others lecture. And in Kaya, under a fading sun and a rising spirit, Ibrahim Traoré proved that revolutions don't always begin with fire. Sometimes they begin with presence. A few days later, the sun rose hot over Dori, a dusty town at the edge of the Sahel, once known for its silence, now buzzing with a new kind of energy. Hundreds had gathered. Young men in faded fatigues, women wearing their finest wraps, elders leaning on canes. They came not for spectacle, but for purpose. And standing before them, in the open, beneath a bullet-ridden flagpole, was Ibrahim Traoré. There was no stage, no teleprompter, just a microphone, a cracked speaker, and raw anticipation. Minutes earlier, he'd watched a training exercise, 18 to 22-year-olds performing combat drills in patched uniforms, using refurbished weapons and courage in place of armor. He waited until they were done, then stepped forward. "You are not a substitute army," he said. "You are the new face of Burkina Faso's dignity." The words hit harder than any battle cry. The crowd roared not out of loyalty, but from something deeper, recognition. Some had waited years to hear it. Others had never imagined they would. But Traoré wasn't finished. "They say we are isolated," he continued. "They say no one will work with us. But what is isolation, if it means not, depending on those who've never shed blood for us?" He pointed at the volunteers behind him, faces sunburned, eyes alert. "So yes," he said, "I choose to be isolated with my people, than to be surrounded by false applause, and abandon the moment bullets start flying." That was the moment. You could feel it. The shift from speeches to soul. Some clutched their hearts. Others raised fists. Women ululated. The air itself trembled with purpose. And then Traoré delivered the line that would echo across every corner of Burkina Faso. "They tell us we must copy systems, open everything, accept everything. I say no." The crowd leaned in. African freedom isn't purchased in foreign manuals. Et declared. It is forged with loyalty to our people, earned by standing firm. Not when it's easy, but when it matters most. He looked toward the horizon, where the desert met the sky. "This," he said, "is our land, and we do not need permission to defend it." The applause didn't stop, and the impact didn't stay in Dori. Within hours, in footage spread like wildfire, TikTok videos, WhatsApp messages, Facebook Reels, each carrying the voice of a man who had dared to call a generation into clarity. Suddenly, Traoré wasn't just a president. He was a pulse. And the phrase that would soon appear on school walls, street murals, and printed t-shirts had already taken root. If being a free African is a problem for the world, then the problem is not in Africa. In that moment, under the blazing Sahel sun, something undeniable happened. A nation didn't just cheer for its leader. It recognized itself in him. And that, more than any bullet or ballot, was the beginning of a revolution. The speech in Dori hadn't even cooled before its aftershocks began rippling far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Bamako, the military leaders of Mali released a video. No suits, no scripts, just uniforms, boots, and one bold sentence. What Traoré said is what many of us think, but few dare to say. Then came Niger, then Guinea, then whispers from even farther south, private calls, encrypted messages, signals of quiet solidarity. And behind all of them, a single headline kept appearing: the Sahel Dignity Pact. It was no longer just a phrase. It was policy. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger jointly announced the creation of a new military command based not in Washington, not in Paris, but in Mopti. A new strategy, a new response team, joint patrols, cross-border operations, coordinated logistics. No more waiting for international task forces. No more middlemen. The message: African security must be decided by Africans. The West didn't stay silent. They couldn't. France and Germany pulled civilian advisors from Ouagadougou, citing institutional hostility and security risks. The EU threatened to freeze cooperation. Human rights watchdogs increased pressure. But Traoré did not budge. Instead, he addressed the nation in a nighttime broadcast. No fireworks. No filters. Just him, seated at a plain wooden desk. If losing agreements is the price of dignity, he said, then we will pay. If speaking the truth costs us comfort, then let us be uncomfortable. But we will never accept a future written by others. Outside, people watched on old radios, cracked TVs, and flickering phone screens. Inside, something else was forming. In the north, local militias, once considered scattered, were now fully integrated into Burkina Faso's central command. They weren't just holding ground, they were reclaiming it. Abandoned villages were retaken. School walls repainted. The flag lifted again by hands that had almost forgotten how to raise it. But what shook the world wasn't just the victories. It was why they fought. Not for salaries, they were still meager. Not for revenge, but for meaning. Because for the first time, they believed someone was fighting with them, not just for them. And everywhere the flag returned, so did the stories. In one village, a soldier was welcomed back by children, who ran toward him, holding paper flowers. In another, a woman served a meal with shaking hands, whispering, "We thought no one would come." The West called it populism. Some even warned of radicalization. But in the homes, fields, and courtyards of the Sahel, it felt like something else. Clarity. Traoré's words were no longer confined to speeches. They were being sewn into uniforms, painted on murals, chanted at youth rallies, cited in university lectures. And for every foreign official scrambling to control the narrative, there were thousands of young Africans rewriting their own. This wasn't isolation. It was ignition. And it wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about a continent beginning to remember its voice and refusing to lower it. Something rare began happening in the streets of Ouagadougou. It wasn't fear. It wasn't protests. It wasn't even anger. It was hope. Handwritten banners appeared on balconies. Kids walked to school with Traoré's quotes scribbled across their backpacks. Rap groups dropped tracks, sampling his speeches. Street artists painted murals of him, not as a hero, but as a man standing in the dust, beside his people. Africa is not a laboratory. One wall read, If being a free African is a problem, then the problem is not in Africa, said another. Spray, painted across an abandoned gas station, now turned youth center, at the University of Ouagadougou. Political science students organized a public seminar sovereignty. In practice, they weren't debating anymore. They were designing, asking how a nation could define its destiny without waiting for permission. And while the elite scrambled to interpret Traoré'S motives, the streets already understood he wasn't playing a role. He was living a conviction. In a rural village called Kupela, a cooperative of women farmers renamed their new storehouse the Dignity Center. When asked why, their leader simply said, "Because dignity feeds more than rice." In Jibo, returning soldiers were met by crowds of children waving paper flags. One of them, no older than 10, saluted and shouted, "Now we fight with purpose." Meanwhile, in mosques and churches, religious leaders began speaking openly about resistance, not through violence, but through resilience. In Bobo Dioulasso, a Muslim cleric told his congregation, "When a people rise with dignity, God walks with them." It wasn't about Ibrahim Traoré anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried under decades of debt, dependency, and diplomatic doublespeak. Now, it was waking up. Even Traoré seemed to understand this shift. He stopped giving long speeches. Instead, he showed up in schools, in farms, in barracks. He didn't promise miracles. He offered something rarer presence. And that's what changed everything. Because in a continent used to leaders who disappear behind palace walls, Traoré walked through markets and sat beneath trees, listening to teachers, elders, widows, not issuing commands, but absorbing pain. And from that presence, a strange thing happened. Belief returned. People began to imagine a future written in their own handwriting with their own smudges, their own struggles, their own names. The international media tried to frame it as rebellion. Others called it populism. But on the ground, it felt simpler. It felt like ownership. And so, beneath the hot plains of Burkina Faso, without theatrics, without grand declarations, a new kind of leadership was born. One not built on fear or slogans, but on consistency, on courage, on coherence. In the end, Traoré didn't offer salvation. He offered something far more powerful, a mirror. And in it, a people saw, not just a man, they saw themselves, standing tall. And for the first time in a long time, they believed they could walk forward on their own terms.